Welcome to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm the producer and your host, Deborah Sloss, licensed marriage and family therapist, and my pronouns are she, her. According to information from the Child Mind Institute, anxiety disorders are the most common mental health disorders of childhood and adolescence. Nearly 1 in 3 adolescents, that's 31.9% of all teenagers, will meet criteria for an anxiety disorder by the age of 18. This number represents a steady increase that's been occurring since 2007. Adding to this trend, the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in a dramatic increase in the rate of anxiety problems and social risks among children, adolescents, and young adults in the United States and globally. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website, of those teens with anxiety, more than 1 in 3 will also have behavior problems and depression. Because this is a growing mental health problem affecting so many teens, for today's show, we're remixing an interview that we first conducted back in 2020 about teens with anxiety. Joining us for this interview is college student Elena Shain, who shares her story of navigating severe anxiety symptoms since early childhood. Also with us is child and adolescent psychologist Sheilah Siegel. We're also joined by Tucker, Elena's psychiatric service dog, who plays an important role in helping Elena navigate the world. We recorded this interview remotely, shortly after the start of the coronavirus pandemic and shelter-in-place orders. Let me tell you more about our guests today. At the time of this interview, Elena Shain was a community college student preparing to transfer to a college in New York. She had struggled with anxiety for as long as she could remember, and at age 10, her symptoms became so severe and were manifesting in behavior problems that caused safety issues for her and her family. Elena's parents and care providers agreed that residential treatment was needed, and that is where she spent the next 2 years. Equipped with the skills she learned there, Elena returned home considerably more able to work with her family and school to find ways to navigate her life and succeed in her endeavors, and has since found solace in creative solutions and pathways in her life. Getting and training her service dog, Tucker, has expanded and improved her ability to be out in the world with more ease, and Elena now takes every opportunity to work with Tucker to educate others about mental health and connect with students in similar situations. Dr. Sheilah Siegel is a licensed clinical psychologist in Santa Cruz, California. She's been in private practice for over 20 years, specializing in working with teens, young adults, and families. Sheilah's also been on the faculty of several psychology graduate programs, as well as a guest lecturer for undergraduate students at the University of California at Santa Cruz. Sheilah integrates a variety of therapeutic modalities such as cognitive behavior therapy, family therapy, and solution-focused therapy. Welcome, Elena and Sheilah, to State of Mind.
Thank you.
So glad you're both here with me today. And I'm really excited that we're going to be talking about this topic because it is, I think, ever present in so many people's lives. So Sheilah, you're here to talk with us more about what are these conditions we refer to as anxiety. Could you start by talking about what this thing called anxiety is and like what conditions fall within that diagnostic category?
Sure. Anxiety disorders develop from a complex set of risk factors, including things like genetics, family history, our brain chemistry, our temperament. Some people think of that as personality, our social models, life stressors, or even traumas. So there are a number of forms of anxiety disorders, and most of them fall into about 6 diagnostic categories. So just briefly, I'll touch on those. Okay.
Yeah.
The first is called generalized anxiety disorder, which is essentially feeling anxious without really clear triggering events to a point that it interferes with our daily activities, and symptoms include things like constant worry, restlessness, and trouble with concentration. Another form of an anxiety disorder is called obsessive compulsive disorder. And that's when we have excessive thoughts, which are often referred to as obsessions. And those can then lead to repetitive behaviors, which are referred to as compulsions. So OCD also often centers on themes like fear of germs or a need to arrange objects in a particular way. And a third anxiety disorder is panic disorder. This is a type of anxiety disorder that causes panic attacks, which are sudden feelings of terror when there's actually no immediate danger. When people have a panic attack, they might feel very out of control with a lot of physical symptoms like a rapid heart rate, sped up breathing to the point of hyperventilating, sweating, numbness, tingling, a feeling of not even being in reality or feeling super detached from yourself, and a real need to just run away from something that it feels like could be happening at any moment. And the other thing about panic attacks is that they can occur unexpectedly, even during a calm state, as well as during an anxious state. A fourth anxiety disorder category is post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's a condition that is typically triggered by a terrifying event or a trauma, either by personally experiencing that or even watching something happen. So those symptoms can include things like flashbacks or difficulty sleeping, nightmares, intrusive and really scary thoughts about the event. And there can be ongoing triggers from post-traumatic stress disorder that can bring back memories of the event over months and even years. A fifth area is called social phobia. And this is a form of anxiety in which everyday social interactions can actually cause a fear of being judged or a worry about potential embarrassment or humiliation, and often a worry about potentially offending someone. And all of those worries can then trigger the person suffering to avoid social interactions or even the potential for a social interaction.
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, we have a category of just kind of other kinds of phobias. Basically, phobias are a type of anxiety that are defined by an excessive fear of an object or a situation. Our most common action phobia is public speaking, which I can appreciate as I'm taking my deep breaths right now.
Yes.
Or a fear of leaving one's home, agoraphobia, heights, snakes, spiders, a fear of vomiting, a fear of enclosed spaces. The real common denominator here, though, with phobias is that it's anxiety that's driving our need for control over what seems uncontrollable. And because of that, we want to then avoid it.
That's a great description. And then there always tends to be those things that don't fit neatly, right, into
Mm-hmm.
one or any of those categories. I was thinking particularly when you were talking about the post-traumatic stress, for example, sometimes people will have lots of small events that add up. Do you want to talk at all about that and leads to something that looks like PTSD but may not actually meet that criteria?
Sure, and that can be referred to even as like an acute stress disorder, and it can be a consequence, absolutely, of cumulative stressors.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of what we look for then is to understand the precipitating events and to take a look at patterns of reaction, patterns of behavior.
Wonderful.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. So, I would say that most high school and college students would say they're really stressed out at any given time, right? So, can you say, like, well, what's the difference between something that would be like a clinical anxiety disorder and periodically being stressed out by a situation?
Sure. I mean, for all of us, anxiety actually does act as a useful and protective emotion, right? It gets our attention that there's something that we need to be concerned about or thoughtful of. Anxiety, though, becomes problematic when it occurs in the absence of a threat or when the reaction that we have is way out of proportion to the threat involved. So, in the case of our high school student, that person is someone who may be very capable and has studied a lot for a very minor quiz, but yet they find themselves in the high school bathroom having a severe panic attack prior to that quiz.
Hmm. Thank you. That's a great example. And how common would you say, having these more serious kind of symptoms of anxiety is among our youth?
Well, gosh, there are a variety of symptoms, often unique to each person. And what it comes down to more than anything is having that stress reaction that's out of proportion to the impact of the event. It's very upsetting for teens, and unfortunately is becoming increasingly common. And in fact, at this point, our rates of anxiety in our youth have actually doubled.
Really? What is that? So, yeah, I think in the intro I talked something about 1 in 3. Is that the kind of numbers you're talking about? 1 in 3?
Yes, yes, and in fact, in girls, that number even can be higher, right, up to 40 to 50%, depending upon the context.
Wow. And we're not talking about stressed out. We're talking about with clinical anxiety symptoms then.
The recent number I read was 32%.
Wow, that's a lot.
And climbing.
Elena is also here with us today, and she's a college student, and she's going to share about her own journey of experiencing pretty severe anxiety symptoms as she was a young child and throughout her teens and into her early adulthood. And she's come to learn so much about herself and develop skills to better cope and gotten support and developed some really creative approaches and strategies that allow her to now live a very full and engaging life. So happy you're here, Elena, to share with us. Would you be willing to give us a picture of what you were like as a child? And I understand by the time you were 10, things had gotten very bad for you. Um, would you be willing to describe what was going on for you then?
Yeah, of course. So it surprises a lot of people because I'm pretty self-aware that I don't really remember much of the emotional memory, probably like before middle school. So I can tell you events, I can tell you facts, but I cannot really recall what I was feeling exactly. As a kid, I was certainly very, very shy, very, very unsure of everything. I didn't try new things as much because I was afraid not only if am I going to be able to finish this thing that I signed myself up for, or am I going to some anxiety is suddenly going to come up, making it so I cannot finish whatever I started, like being in a show. Am I going to get so anxious that I can't perform? So therefore, there's no point in doing it in the first place. So it was that kind of anxiety, and then a lot of just in social situations, not really talking much at all, and just being so overwhelmed that I just kind of went inward and shut down for just a lot of the time that I was walking around.
What was going on at 10 that led to things getting so bad for you? Do you know, like what kind of behaviors were going on and what happened at that time?
So I had just switched schools to start 4th grade, and there was a camping trip at the beginning, and it was a 3-day camping trip, and my mom took me, and the agreement was that she would be a chaperone, but she would have her own tent. And I said I can't sleep in this tent alone without my mom. And the teacher convinced her that no, I needed to just get over it. So they made me sleep in the tent alone with the other kids for one night, and it went horribly. So the next night I came back to her. I said, it didn't go well last time. I need to do it again. I need to go to your tent now. And the teacher again convinced her, no, you need to just let her cry it out. And that was, I think I was already going downhill at that point, but that was a really traumatic event for me. And what my mom says is that she realizes that she should have listened to me and that she knows that I know myself. So from then on, I didn't trust anybody at school. I didn't trust anything really. And my anxiety had already been pretty bad before, so it was just completely downhill, violent behavior, regressive behavior. I talked like a baby. I played with baby toys. I could not go to school. Homeschool didn't work. Therapy 3 times a week didn't work. It was just, nothing was working. My brother was not safe around me, so he had to leave the house or I had to leave the house. And I wasn't able to live at all. And nobody else in my family was really able to live either.
Yeah. God, it sounds like you were just under intense threat and panic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Elena, we were just talking with you about how things got very bad for you at 10. And you said things really started to go downhill after a sequence of events related to school. So, do you want to describe what happened at that point? What kind of, you said something about residential. What does that mean? What kind of treatment did you go to?
So there was some tipping point. I can't remember what it was, but it sent me to the psychiatric hospital. And once I was there, my parents realized, and my team, that it wasn't safe for me to come home. So over a process of 2 weeks, they got me placed in a treatment center in Wisconsin, which was mostly for diagnostic purposes.
Mm-hmm.
They thought I was going to come home. They weren't sure. After I went through the diagnostic process, they realized it still wasn't safe for me to come home. So I was placed in a longer term place in Montana, where I was for about 1.5 years, which um, was more addressing more than just the anxiety, because the diagnostic placement was based on exposure therapy, and it was a 3-month program. And I zoomed through that, but even after I got through that, there were still so many issues
Mm-hmm.
that needed to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Did you find that helpful?
Um, I don't have much memory of the exposure therapy part of it. I wasn't as close with people there. I think it wasn't bad,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and
I
I
guess
certainly still use exposure therapy, but the longer term residential place, I'm still very close with everybody there.
so
And
that part you
yeah,
found really helpful.
yeah.
Do you want to say what aspects of it a little bit might have been helpful to you?
They set it up in a way that it was like a family. So the staff were like kind of your adopted parents, and it was all about forming trusting relationships, and then we would work on from there. But I was able to form really, really close relationships with some of the staff members. There was one guy, we just hung out all the time, and
Right.
everybody was just really, and then they worked with the family as a whole too, which was really nice, so that by the time it was all over, the entire family had skills, and the entire family knew not only they could change their behaviors, but they knew how to work with me, I knew how to work with them, and it strengthened the family relationship so that it was I could become more successful when I got home, even if there were still things that came up, which of course there were.
Right. So it didn't totally resolve everything, but you definitely sounds like you and your family were all more resourced when you came home.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the last thing I want to ask you about before we turn to Sheilah is just if you could just describe a little bit about how your anxiety symptoms. So you were talking about what it looked like when you were a child, right?
Hmm.
And then you came back a couple years later after your treatment. Can you describe, and you sort of hinted the fact that those symptoms are still with you. If you could just give like an overview about how they've transitioned, over the years up until now, because now here you are at 20, right? Going to college and living your life with Tucker's help.
Yeah, I would say that they become significantly less severe, even if it's a small step every year. Once I got back from residential, I was more stabilized, so I think I was more able to tell why I was anxious. Before it was just a blinding mob of anxiety all the time. So then, as I got through middle school and especially in high school, was when I really realized what my major triggers were, like being around like certain male teachers and stuff. That was the major issue for me. And I think a lot of it has just been coming to accept, one, coming to figure out what am I even anxious about, and then coming to accept what I'm anxious about, even if it's kind of embarrassing that, this perfectly harmless male teacher is making me really anxious and now I can't go to class. But once I came to accept that, and I come to become more comfortable with it every year, to the point where now I feel comfortable talking about it, which also makes it easier for me to work with people I'm anxious around and plan ahead and just be more confident in myself because I know that I can deal with it.
You're listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and for this interview, I'm talking with college student Elena Shain, who's sharing her story of navigating severe anxiety since she was a young child. Also with us is child and adolescent psychologist Sheilah Siegel, who's helping us understand more about teen anxiety, symptoms, treatment approaches, and resources. This interview was originally conducted back in 2020, early in the coronavirus pandemic, and there are times our guests refer to that specific stressor. However, there have been so many large-scale and intense societal stressors since then and still going on today, like George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter movement, the January 6th insurrection, wars in Syria and Israel, and widespread and threatening unrest in the Middle East, that we believe the information and coping strategies shared here are as relevant today as they were then. Back to our interview. So, Sheilah, you after hearing Elena's story, I'm curious about which parts stand out to you as typical or not, and maybe you could describe for our listeners what some of those sort of signs of when children are experiencing anxiety, for instance, what some of the signs are. She gave the indication she couldn't come and say, I'm anxious, right? So
Yeah.
instead, there were behaviors and different things that were going on for her.
Sure. Well, first, Ellen, I would like to acknowledge what a phenomenal job you and your family have done in addressing anxiety. And I just am so inspired by your hard work and your ongoing bravery, really. I think it's just wonderful. And what I would say is that typically anxiety is a normal part of childhood, and every kiddo goes through phases that are typically harmless and very temporary. That kids who suffer from an anxiety disorder actually experience fear and nervousness, shyness to a point that it gets them to avoid places and activities. So a child with anxiety, with mild anxiety, can actually be reassured and be comforted. However, that's not the case for kids with more severe anxiety. And that's what puts them at risk then for poor school performance or missing out on really important social experiences.
And something that stood out to me when Elena was talking is that it's so common for younger children, at least, for those symptoms to show up in either behaviors or physical symptoms, like stomach aches or um, headaches or behaviors. Like she said, I couldn't really identify and say I felt anxious. So instead, it would be expressed in these kind of behaviors. So when parents are seeing those kinds of things, they don't make the connection between what that behavior is and what might be going on. For some kid that maybe is a little bit slightly fearful, pushing them to stay in the tent and having them have a successful experience would make sense. But for a child who's experiencing something more severe, Sheilah, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, well, there's certainly that can be so hard to assess, and when it is more severe, there's a real need for a graduated kind of exposure to the source of anxiety, and a real need for teaching that child some ways of being able to calm themselves so that they have a resource to use when they are bravely leaning into that increased challenge.
Elena, I'd love to come back to you and see, um, are you still at this point in your life struggling with symptoms of anxiety, and what kind of things do you do to cope or help yourself?
I'm definitely still struggling with a lot of anxiety. I don't notice it a lot of times because it's become such a normal daily part of life, and because I can recognize times when it was a lot worse, but still, I'm always worrying about when I'm walking around on campus, who am I going to run into? Which bathroom am I going to use? Am I even going to use the bathroom? What am I going to eat? Where am I going to eat it? When am I going to eat it? What am I going to wear based on who I'm going to run into? Then my service dog helps me a lot, but then I have anxieties around him. Is he behaving well enough that people, think that he's actually a well-trained service dog? Where are we going to have him go to the bathroom? Then there's like taking Lyft with drivers. There's all sorts of little things that are just constantly going. I've just become a lot better at coping, which is mostly through the use of my service dog. Um, One of my big things is just I can now recognize that it's going to pass. So even if I'm very anxious, sometimes I just let myself feel it and just wait for it to pass because I can't necessarily change it in that moment. But knowing that it will pass, I think makes it goes a little bit quicker and it's a little bit less scary.
You mentioned, Tucker being helpful to you, your service dog. Can you say something about how is he helpful to you?
Mostly he allows me to have a great deal more mobility than I had before. Before I got him in high school, I couldn't walk around the campus at all. I couldn't use any of the bathrooms because I was afraid of running into a certain teacher. So I had to basically hide in one classroom all day long, every day. I couldn't even walk past windows where people might be sitting and see me. So he's allowed me to just be able to walk around knowing that I'm at least somewhat protected, even though he's, pretty wimpy, but he's trying.
Yeah, so the effect on you is that you feel a lot more protected with his presence, it sounds like.
Right.
The,
And he
the,
also gives me a a task and a reason to do things. So I have a purpose every day. I've got to take care of him. I've got to walk him. My focus is more on him instead of ruminating over my own anxiety.
is that the one thing that you would credit the most with helping you, or is there something else?
I don't know. I would credit residential more, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think I often say it saved my life, and those people are still really, really important to me. I have a scholarship from that organization, so I still feel very much connected to them. And I think without them, I wouldn't even know or have the skills to be able to figure out how to get a service dog or how to, you know, find all these new coping mechanisms that I discover as I go along.
It's wonderful to hear you say that, I think, because I think many people have this idea in their head that, you know, something like residential treatment or having to go away from your family is a disastrous thing happening. So it's really great to hear you say that, while it might have been incredibly hard for everyone involved at the time, um, that on this other side of it, you see it as really laying the foundation for the life you've lived since.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um, is there anything, Sheilah, you want to say about that from your experience of working with kids with anxiety? I'm curious.
Oh, sure. Well, again, I just continue to be so impressed with Elena, and I too have teens and young adults in my practice who return from residential and truly credit their connections and opportunities there with being life-saving. And so I'm glad that we're dispelling any kind of myth or concerns that their community may have about using residential treatment as an important modality. I will say that in preparation for our chat today, I asked a number of my teen clients about their recommendations for what they have found to be most helpful. And I loved what they came up with.
Yeah, let's
One,
hear.
Sure. So one person talked about the importance for her of learning how to breathe deeply in a way that creates relaxation in her body, and how she feels a sense of mastery now about her nervous system. One of her favorite things is to use an app that's called Worry Breath, and she can just whip it out on her phone if she's in a grocery store line or waiting to go into a social event. And she's finding that to be just an on-the-spot tool. Another person talked about the benefit of calling a friend, and a number of the teens in my practice, like Elena, have pets. And I too actually have a therapy dog named Kona, who is always in my office as another support. Other teens have talked about the benefit of having hobbies and being able to play music, busting out an instant kind of a dance party, dancing to a favorite song just to kind of get moving and shift their whole vibe. Um, Other teens have talked about noticing that when they get off their technology, when they get away from their phones and their computer and actually look up and go outside, that they feel fantastic by having a bit of a reset in nature. Um, and a number of teens in my practice who struggle with social phobia emphasize the benefit of signing up for structured sorts of activities, like joining a school club or a team sport. One of my teen clients shocked her whole family when she signed up for cheerleading. And everyone was stunned that she did that. But she said actually it made complete sense for her, because she had a reason then to be out there moving and learning moves, and it made it very easy to relate with her peers. And then two other things I'll just mention that came up with every single teen in my practice. One is the power of eating healthfully by maintaining their blood sugar levels. And then secondly, cutting out substances like caffeine and nicotine, vaping. We work on vaping a lot, and other drugs.
So I want to come back to you, Elena. What, if anything, have made things harder for you along the way?
I think, I mean, I certainly get in my own way a lot. I certainly dragged my feet for a long time at residential. If you asked them, they could say, like, the first 2 months I was a robot and then suddenly they put me in a show and they're like, she talks? Really? We didn't know that. But I think that's all part of my process, and it helps me to learn better. I think the bigger issue for me is that I don't give myself enough credit, and I don't recognize the challenges that I'm going through, because I know so many people that have been through a lot worse, or who are struggling with things that I see as more difficult currently. So I think I don't have any problems. I have no reason to feel sorry for myself, or I have no reason to reach out and get these resources that could go to other people that might need them more. I struggle like with having a service dog. I know I need a service dog. I know that he has tasks that he performs that really, really help me. But then I think, but I'm not those other people that maybe could use a service dog more, so why should I be able to have a service dog? So it's a lot of things like that, getting in my own way and selling myself short so that I can't actually recognize how far I've come.
Wow. Wow. So Sheilah, after hearing what Elena has been doing, and are there other coping skills or strategies that you think would be good for our listeners to know about?
Yeah, so, and I do just very much want to highlight what Elena said about the benefit of having a daily schedule. I think that's a key thing. I think many of us, I think, felt a real sense of disorientation to our current circumstances, and we're all making an effort to adapt to this temporary kind of new normal. And so, yes, having something that's predictable and that we can count on, a consistent time to go to sleep, to wake up, knowing that we're going to exercise and when and how, where, what we're to, again, you talked about knowing what you're going to eat. That's really an important one. What are we eating, when, who's preparing it, how's that going to work? And having ways to socialize. So many teams in my practice have been creating social hangouts on Zoom, having Zoom parties, or they've also been using Netflix Party to be able to watch movies together, and that's been really helpful. One other thing I'll refer people to is a wonderful column in the New York Times by Lisa DeMoore, who's a clinical psychologist, and she specifically wrote about 5 ways that we can help teens manage anxiety through this time of the coronavirus. And just to highlight a few of those ideas, one is even being able to just normalize that anxiety right now makes sense, right? There's a lot of emerging news, and there are a lot of things that we don't know about the coronavirus. And so, yeah, that's going to trigger us feeling unsettled. Also, though, another recommendation is to focus on what we do know. We do know that we're currently safe. We do know we can wash our hands and we can socially distance. And so to put more of our focus on what we know rather than what we don't know. And then lastly, I would just add encouraging distractions from all of the coronavirus worries, that we can focus on other things like doing homework or watching a favorite TV show, really limiting our coronavirus media exposure.
Great, thank you so much. Elena, I just want to come back to you and ask, when you were in school, elementary, or even later after you came back from residential treatment, did you have any specific kind of supports in school that were geared to help you with anxiety?
Yeah, so actually before I left, I got an IEP. The school district was the one who paid for a lot of the residential, but when I came back, I retained the IEP and
Can I just define that for our listeners? That's called it. That means an individualized education plan.
Yeah, so I retained it, and primarily what it was just a way of showing my teachers that I had a disability and that I needed help. I don't know if I used it all that much. It was kind of there as a caveat if I need, it was more of a safety tool for me. It became more important, I think, in high school because that was when, tests come in. So then there was extra time on tests, stuff like that.
Yeah, could you give a couple more examples of what kinds of things that you might have used as part of that?
So there was the ability to just hang out in the special education room, even though I didn't really have a reason to be there. Mm-hmm. I think a couple times there were like late assignments that was allowed without penalty. Just the yearly meetings that were called, because just for everybody to meet together were really helpful.
So everybody knew that that's what you were dealing with,
Yeah.
and had some understanding of that. Mm-hmm. So Sheilah, I want to come back to you. Elena was talking about having some supports in school, and I'm wondering if you could just briefly talk about what kinds of academic supports are available for students who might be experiencing anxiety.
Sure, there are a variety of ways in which we can make education more accessible. So there's the individualized education plan that Elena referenced, which is an actual capacity to modify either the way in which school curriculum is delivered or even how a student would access that curriculum. And then there's also a 504, which is actually more of accommodating within just the existing classroom environment. The key here, though, is regardless of the actual kind of legal structure of it. Things like Elena mentioned, being able to go to a quiet space, a different environment to regroup, being able to have extra time even for tests. Another accommodation I often recommend is for students not to be randomly called upon, but to actually choose when they're going to raise their hand. And it can also be enormously helpful to get a copy of teacher notes, because it's hard to keep up with what the lecturer is saying when there's so much going on internally. So those are just a few examples.
This is State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and I'm talking with college student Elena Shain, who's sharing her story and her wisdom gained from navigating severe anxiety in childhood and throughout her teens. Also with us is child and adolescent psychologist Sheilah Siegel, who provides information about teen anxiety symptoms, treatment approaches, and resources. This interview was originally conducted back in 2020, early in the coronavirus pandemic, and there are times our guests refer to that specific stressor. However, given the many large-scale and intense societal stressors that have occurred since then and are still going on today, we believe the information shared here is still relevant and useful. Every State of Mind episode has a resource list, and the resources we talk about today and more can be found in the show notes for this episode. You can also listen or subscribe to our podcasts on all the major podcasting sites and on your home smart speaker. Show notes, resources, our podcasts, and where to subscribe to them can all be found at www.stateofmindmedia.org. Now, back to our interview. So there is one area I realize we haven't touched on yet, and I'd like to ask you about, Elena, and that is, have you used medication support, and has that made a difference for you?
Yeah, I've definitely been on medications for a long time, so I don't necessarily remember what it would be like to not have them. I think they are very helpful, and what I will say is that it helps a lot because I know that my team and my psychiatrist know me very, very well, and we check in frequently even if there's no issues going on. And I also know that they're always working to minimize whatever I'm on and to make sure the side effects are minimized, so I can be confident that the medications that I am on right now are really what I do need and are actually benefiting me, even if I don't necessarily remember what it would be like to not have them.
So, that makes me want to ask you, because not everyone says they have a good working relationship with their psychiatrist like that. What would you say, what have you done to help create a relationship like that with your psychiatrist?
So we meet about once every month or so, and I've had the same psychiatrist since I returned from residential. So that's probably 6 years, maybe 6, 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just the ability to check in whenever, just frequently, even if nothing is going wrong. I would say the vast majority of the time we don't change anything when we meet. And also, my psychiatrist and my therapist and my parents all communicate with each other. So everybody is aware of what is going on, and everybody knows each other and can therefore read me. So even if I'm not sure completely if I need to change my medications, they can look at me and say, well, I can see that you're like this now and you've been like this in the past, so I would recommend that you do this, instead of just, hey, there's an issue, oh, I've never seen you before, well, try this.
So those interactions between people who are close to you is really important, it sounds like, for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sheilah, would you want to add anything to that in terms of advisement for people who might be seeing a psychiatrist about how to get the most out of that experience?
Sure. Yeah, I completely agree with Elena about the importance of having a team and that collaboration. And I think it's important for people to make sure that they're going to have adequate time to meet with their psychiatrist, the first time especially, and to be able to cover a thorough history of the family as well as just previous medications, and making sure that the teen is really being respected about their self-report as well as what their goals are. There are some common problems, if I could address those for a moment. I find for people who are taking medication for anxiety, and it's initially when they first work with a psychiatrist, often there isn't an adequate emphasis on the interplay between nutrition and medication efficacy. And so a lot of, particularly the SSRIs, very much require adequate protein in order to work effectively. And so making sure that there's good conversation about and education about appropriate nutrition. And then also just the need to reduce caffeine and tobacco, right? Other sorts of substances can very much interfere with the ability of medication to be effective, as well as the importance of adequate hydration and exercise, sleep. So, and then lastly, I will just say, I think it's very important that a psychiatrist takes the approach of titrating a medication up gradually. Often we want to have just throw on a light switch and feel better immediately, of course, we want relief. And yet I liken this process more like turning up a dimmer switch very gradually. And that's much better for teens to not have to suffer from side effects that way.
We're getting close to the end of our time. So these last questions that I'm going to ask are just sort of for both of you. I'm wondering if, there was a teen listening that could relate to some or all of what you've said today, and they were thinking about maybe trying to get help for themselves. Is there something that each of you would recommend as a first step? And either of you can go first.
So I would recommend, don't be afraid to seek a therapist or a psychiatrist or whoever, but also don't be ashamed. Try not to. Own your anxiety or own your depression or whatever you have, because once you can do that, then you can advocate for yourself and start figuring out what you need. And it might take a little bit of trial and error and some creative solutions, and it's an ongoing process, but it's all about just accepting it if you can and working with it instead of working against it.
What about you, Sheilah?
I 100% agree. I think the big thing is to know that you're very much worthy of being supported, and that you're not, odd, or that it's not that you're being dramatic or that you're over exaggerating, in a cry for help. That what's happening is real, and to trust your experience and express your feelings to someone, anyone. It could be a friend, a school counselor, talk to your parents, talk to your healthcare provider. But the key, I really agree with Elena, that it's about knowing that you really deserve to benefit from support, to be able to use anxiety as a resource ultimately, rather than having it have to be a disability.
Yeah, and I think something that you mentioned earlier, Elena, is that way that people think, well, it's not bad enough to get help. I think it's really important for people to know that it doesn't need to be really bad for them to get help. In fact, if they get some help, it might not get that bad.
Right.
Yeah. So also, I'm just wondering if there are any last resources that we have not talked about that you might want to be sure that our listeners know about. Is there any last ones you want to mention?
So I have, because we all have to travel at some point, obviously not now, but when it comes back, we use TSA Cares in my family, which is pretty good for anxiety because it helps you whip through security, which is the worst for me, but you can also get escorted around other places. And you can find that at tsa.gov/travel/passenger dash support. And then also my service dog trainer, who, even though he doesn't live here currently, his daughter does. And he's just a really good resource because he's very knowledgeable on the subject and he can direct you in the right direction. And you can find him at Martin with a Y, caninebehavior.com.
Great. And I just want to go back when you're talking about TSA Cares, that's for airline travel,
Yes,
right?
yes,
To help
airline
people
travel.
navigate airline travel. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Anything, Sheilah, that you haven't already talked about that you want to mention?
I will just say that there are some great online resources, and one website in particular is from the Child Mind Institute, which is www.childmind.org. And then certainly the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, which is www.adaa.org. And lastly, I will say there are some fantastic books that have come out recently. My favorite recent read is by Sophie Riegel, and the title is Don't Tell Me to Relax, One Teen's Journey to Survive Anxiety and How You Can Too. And I have been prescribing this to many, many families and teens, and I'm getting a very positive reception.
Great. Thank you so much. I just really appreciate you being here today to talk about this. Well, that concludes the interview portion of our program. We'll now hear from Iris, a 17-year-old high school student from Salinas, about how she's learned to courageously deal with her anxiety symptoms. Here's Iris.
It was me versus anxiety, and anxiety was winning. I start to feel it, that rippling sensation of insecurity. My throat is caught in a lump. The tears pull in my eyes until they reach the brink and descend down my face, to my chin, and into my shaking hands. My fingers are quivering and shivering, my voice stuttering and stammering. My breathing, it's rapid, it's short, it's stopping. Take a breath, I tell myself. In goes the air, and out comes a small cry. My eyes bolt around the room, no one's watching. Then why am I so scared of eyes that are oblivious to my panic? It's a battle of questions and assumptions in my head. Everyone is staring at me. No one is. But what if they are? No, they're not. My first encounter with anxiety was brutal. I was a high school sophomore, alone in public at the store. It was when a group of teenagers passed me that I felt so self-conscious I wanted to disappear, alone in a space where no one could see me. I didn't know how to cope, heal, or learn from this experience, so it happened again and again, in any public area where I felt a pair of eyes linger on me for a second too long. These episodes were capable of sparking up like fireworks in a matter of seconds, constantly at the mercy of a breakdown at any given moment. So I started staying home, avoiding people, avoiding living my life. I never wanted to feel that horrible panic ever again. There was one thing that brought me out of that self-constructed shell of anxiety that I had created. It was going to the gym. I can't put into words how scared I was on my first day. I felt that familiar sense of panic, the eyes that I believed were watching me, the assumptions I had created. I went home that night and surprisingly went back the next day. I started to get more comfortable after a couple of weeks of lifting, forcing myself into a public area where I would have to deal with my enemy, myself. It was never the people around me. It's so liberating putting all my strength and effort into weightlifting that couldn't compare to the feeling of helplessness that my anxiety had burdened me with. The feeling of pushing and pulling weight with all of my might. The feeling of running miles upon miles until my legs couldn't bear another step. The feeling of my exhausted limbs, wondering if they'll ever move again. I no longer have beads of tears rolling down my face. It's now beads of sweat, result of my hard work. I gained so much, from confidence to self-discipline in a community of people that I know I can rely on. I realized that no one had ever been staring. No one ever spoke any of the assumptions I was thinking. No one ever judged me. I still get these episodes when I spiral down the same path, but it's not as horrible as the first time. At times, I'll be sitting in class, feeling like my mind is trying to tell me to panic. I can't comprehend why, but all I can do is try and tame these feelings. I fill my lungs up with as much air as humanly possible. I distract myself with the feeling of my heartbeat, 2 fingers on my neck, doing my best to slow the beats to a normal pace, taking slow breaths. It's still me versus anxiety, but this time, I'm winning.
I want to say a huge thank you again to our guests today, Elena Shain and Dr. Sheilah Siegel, and to our In Your Voice contributor, Iris. And thanks to you for joining us here on State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I also want to encourage you to check out the wealth of information included on the resource list in the show notes for this episode. New episodes of State of Mind exploring mental health and wellness are released the first Sunday of every month and can be found along with our complete archive on our website at www.stateofmindmedia.org. If you missed part of this episode or you just want to hear it again, subscribe to our podcast on all the major podcast platforms. Also, when you rate and review our podcast, you do help it get found and heard by more listeners. So if you liked this or any of our episodes, could you please do that for us? Special thanks to Jeannie Baldzikowski for audio production, to Jennifer Young for research and outreach, and to Patrice Vecchione for story coaching. And thanks to acoustic guitarist Adrian Legg for composing, performing, and donating the use of our theme music. State of Mind was developed and originally broadcast in association with KSQD-FM in Santa Cruz, California. We always want to hear from listeners and community members just like you. You can submit your very own In Your Voice recording and become part of the conversation, either by calling in to leave us a message or record an audio file right on your phone. Either way, tell us about a mental health experience you've had, something that's contributed to your mental health recovery, or share a resource that's been helpful to you. We really do want to hear from you, and your voice may just be on one of our future shows. Submission details can be found at www.stateofmindmedia.org. Come on back and join us again next month for a whole new episode of State of Mind. Until then, live well.